Ethan stumbled awake in the middle of the night to hear his dog barking. He ran down the stairs to meet mayhem. Something had been in his house, and it had wrecked his kitchen. But the worst part was that it was still in the bushes, watching. When the wild creature finally emerged, Ethan prepared for a bloody battle, but what happened next would change his life forever. The barking wasn't what woke Ethan. He was used to Boxer's constant barking in the thick of the night. What woke Ethan was the snarling and the sound of metals falling in the kitchen. He shot up from his bed, and the fog of sleep evaporated in an instant. What do you think was happening in the kitchen? Ethan felt a dread curl around him as he found his shoes and headed for the door. Boxer's barks were louder now and wilder. It wasn't the usual yipes he gave when he saw a squirrel. No, this was something else. He sounded angry and vicious. He even sounded like he was warning something to stay away. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs as he strained to listen by the stairs. And just as he strained, crash! Something fell and shattered in the kitchen. Ethan flew down the stairs before his brain could process it. His body seemed to be moving on instinct. When he reached the hallway, he realized the air felt colder than it should. Where was the cold air coming from, he wondered. Goosebumps rose on his skin. He frowned, and his pace dropped. The second his foot hit the kitchen tile, his eyes widened. The back door was open. No, it wasn't cracked slightly, it was wide open. Cold air rushed in, and along with it the thick scent of the hibiscus flowers in his garden. But there was also something putrid, something that smelt metallic, too. Blood. Ethan's stomach twisted. As he padded further into the kitchen, his eyes widened. The wind howled through the frame, but it wasn't strong enough to explain the disaster before him. The kitchen was a wreck. Cabinets were crashed open and their contents spilt across the floor. The trash bin was knocked over, and the waste was strewn about, but none of this made his hair rise like the scratches across his floorboards. Claw marks tore across his kitchen floor like there had been a terrible fight. Did Boxer do this? But why? Where was he? He peeped out the door and finally found his dog, Boxer, on the porch barking. Boxer's hair seemed to stand on end, and he bared his fangs as he snarled, barked, and growled. He looked so angry. His tail was up in the air, and they were not wagging at all. Ethan felt fear for the first time in months, but he took more steps closer to his dog. That was when he noticed that it wasn't only rage or fear. He was hurt, too. There was a fresh gash on Boxer's back, and blood darkened his thick coat. It was a deep cut that would need to be checked out, and it looked very painful. Still, Boxer wasn't cowering. He barked powerfully, with his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the yard. Ethan looked around him. Something had been in his house, and Boxer had fought it. He forced himself forward and crouched next to his dog. He didn't know what to do, so he only allowed his fingers to brush through his fur, feeling his sticky, warm, and fresh blood. Boxer didn't flinch. He must have smelt Ethan even before he touched him, but he didn't react. He didn't even try to wag his tail or lick his face. His body remained taut, ready to fight. Ethan followed his gaze. The porch light flickered weakly and lit up the tree line, but the darkness beyond it was thick. The darkness was too heavy to be just from the absence of light. He looked down at Boxer again, and that was when he saw it, a trail of blood glistening like ink in the moonlight. It dotted the porch, streaked down the steps and into the grass, and then disappeared into the trees. And it didn't seem to have come from Boxer. If Ethan's heart had been beating fast before, it would have jumped to a wilder tempo now. He could even hear his heartbeat in his ears. Whatever had been in his house, it wasn't gone. It was out there, waiting, and it was bleeding. His stomach clenched. The thought that Boxer had hurt it should have been reassuring, but the longer he stared at that bloodied trail leading into the woods, the more his fear increased. It was obvious whatever had been in his house hadn't run. It had left on his own terms, maybe leisurely, and it was probably angry and seeking revenge. As if reading his thoughts, suddenly there was movement. A shadow seemed to detach itself from the trees and stepped into the fragile light. Ethan watched the movement slowly until a tiny ray of the porch light illuminated it. He froze. He had expected a lot of things. Another human, another dog, a deer maybe, but not this. He first saw the eyes, yellow and piercing, definitely not the dull ones of a raccoon or the wide gaze of a deer. This was something worse. A wolf, and it was big. Bigger than any wolf he had ever seen outside of documentaries. Its fur was thick and wild, wilder than Boxer's. It was gray and dark, too, but it was also matted with something darker. Blood. As Ethan watched, he noticed other details. Not only was the wolf hurt, but its ribs were also visible beneath his coat. It looked lean and hungry, but Ethan didn't think that was a good thing. A hungry wolf wasn't good news. He was so scared that he could barely move. He could only keep watching the threatening animal. As he watched, he noticed that one of its front legs barely touched the ground as it walked. It was limping, yet it kept marching forward. Boxer's already deep growl deepened even further. But he didn't charge. He was waiting for the wolf to make the first move, waiting for it to attack first. Ethan's pulse pounded against his skull. His instinct screamed at him to run into the kitchen and slam the door, or to grab something, anything, that could be used as a weapon. But his body wouldn't listen, because this wasn't normal. He remained frozen in fear and shock while the wolf came closer and closer. Just when Ethan's body finally began to cooperate and he was ready to dash for a weapon, the wolf made an unexpected sound, a whimper. Ethan frowned. He had expected a threatening howl, not a whimper. He found himself searching its deep yellow eyes. They were sharp even in the dim light, but they were filled with something unsettling, something that looked like pain and maybe desperation. But as he stared, something else happened that surprised him. The wolf turned away. It turned slowly and staggered back towards the tree line. It paused once and looked back again. Then it let out another whimper. Ethan's frown deepened. That wasn't a threat. That sounded more like a plea. But for what? As his eyes followed the retreating animal in confusion, he suddenly noticed something strange. Boxer's growling had stopped. Even its body seemed to relax. It was as if that whimper had told him something Ethan couldn't understand. Ethan was even more confused now. He had no idea what he was supposed to do next. But just as he wondered, the wolf suddenly sprang into the forest. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that Boxer sprang after it. He bolted straight for the wolf but didn't slam into it or attack it. Instead, he ran by his side as if following his lead. "Boxer!" No exclamation mark, Ethan yelled, but his dog ignored him. His paws thumped the cold ground as he disappeared into the night. What was happening? Ethan moved on instinct. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen cabinet and then clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, slicing across the trees until it landed on the running animals. He hesitated for just a second, then he tore after them. His feet hit the porch, then the grass, then the hard-packed dirt, and the night swallowed them whole. It was very hard to keep up with the running animals, but he was quick on his feet, too. Of course, the fact that the wolf was hurt and limping helped a bit. Boxer was ahead, weaving through the underbrush like he knew exactly where he was going. The wolf limped in front of Boxer, and every step he made looked like it might be its last. Ethan cursed under his breath. The cold air burned in his lungs, and his chest began to hurt, but he couldn't let Boxer do this alone. What was Boxer doing? He didn't know, but he had to find out. Branches clawed at him, and the uneven ground with the mess of roots and damp leaves threatened to trip him many times, but he didn't stop running. Boxer obviously knew something. He had understood something he hadn't. Then, just before Ethan finally gave up, the wolf slowed, and Boxer skidded to a stop. The dog's tail was still rigid and raised in the air, but he was no longer barking or snarling. Ethan stumbled to a halt a few paces behind them, breathing hard. He lifted his flashlight and used its beam to search around the darkness. Where were they? Why had the wolf brought them here? At last he found his answer, as the beam settled beneath a large tree. There, nestled between the thick roots of the ancient oak, was what looked like a den. It was a hollowed-out burrow that was barely visible in the tangled underbrush. Ethan stepped forward and peeped in, and his jaw dropped. Inside were tiny, shivering shapes. Wolf pups. They barely stirred. Their frail bodies were curled against each other for warmth, and they let out weak whimpers. They looked sick, and the beams illuminated their bold but tiny ribs, which were pressed against their skin. They looked as hungry as their mother. In fact, they looked even worse. They were starving, maybe even dying. The mother wolf collapsed beside them. She looked exhausted and weak, and Ethan wondered where she had found the strength for that run. She nudged the pups weakly and licked them, her tongue moving over their tiny heads. But it was obvious that that was all she had left to give. Boxer barked once, then stepped forward, lowered his head, and sniffed the closest pup. The tiny creature barely responded. Ethan's wheels began to turn. Suddenly, it made sense. The blood trail, the fight, the desperation, the injured wolf refusing to leave. Their mother had made a powerful sacrifice. She had come all the way searching for help. She hadn't broken into his house to hunt. She hadn't come to harm them. She had come because she was very hungry and desperate, and because she had nothing left to give her pups. She had come to beg for help in providing and protecting her babies. Ethan swallowed hard. His gaze flickered between the mother, the pups, and then his dog. The dog turned to him, and in his dark eyes, Ethan saw the unspoken plea. Help them. His stomach twisted, but he knelt slowly in the dirt, and, carefully, he reached for the dying pups. The mother didn't move. She barely had the strength, but her yellow eyes locked on him, and her eyes followed the movement of his hands. In her eyes, Ethan saw defeat, but he also saw a shimmer of hope. In him. She had risked everything because she had no choice. And now, standing at the edge of this den, Ethan realized that neither did he. His heartbeat still beat fast from the chase, but the terror that had gripped him before had dropped. Ethan let go of the pups and dipped his fingers into his coat pocket. Just as he did, the scent of food drifted into the air. He always left scraps in this coat to treat Boxer, and he still had a lot left. He pulled out the scraps he had shoved in there hours ago and sifted through them, half-eaten pieces of jerky, some bread from dinner, dog biscuits, nothing much. But to the pups, it seemed to be everything. When he placed the food on some leaves and pushed it towards them, they sniffed it but didn't do anything else. So the mother wolf lifted her head. Her muzzle brushed the smallest pup, and she nudged the scraps closer to them, literally guiding them toward the food. Weak as it was, the pup responded. Its trembling nose pressed against the bread, and its tiny mouth opened. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He watched with pure joy as the puppy slurped the scraps and as the other pups joined in. Ethan glanced at his dog. Boxer glanced at him too, and his tail began to wag finally. It was a gesture of acknowledgement and even respect that Ethan understood and valued. When he looked back at the pups, he realized the scraps were almost gone. "Stay," he told his dog, and ran into the forest again. When he returned, he was holding a large bag filled with more food and water. He had brought large pieces of chicken, pork, turkey, and fish, leftovers from a dinner. He had even brought some fruits like apple and banana, along with bottles and bottles of water. He fed the pups, but he also fed their mother. They were no longer predators and prey, just living beings in the same fight for survival. Ethan watched them as they ate. He couldn't stop himself from shivering in the night cold, but the weight of the moment felt heavier than the chill. The trees towered up ahead, but here, in this small hollow space, was a very precious moment. Behind him, Boxer watched the pups, too. He was breathing happily now, and his tag swept the ground as it wagged. The mother wolf hadn't moved from her spot beside the pups. She ate slowly, and she watched her pups as they rushed through the offerings, too. Then she looked up at Ethan and Boxer and let out a low howl. She was thanking them in the only way she knew how. Ethan smiled. He had done all he could. He knew that, and now it was time to leave. He turned and began to walk back toward the trees. His boots crunched against the dried roots and twigs on the ground. Behind him, Boxer hesitated. The dog took one last lingering look at the den. He had been the bridge between the two worlds, between the human and beast, and now he allowed his gaze to flicker from the mother to the pups and back again. Then, with a final bark, he turned and trotted after Ethan, and together they walked into the woods. The wolf didn't follow. She only watched as the night swallowed them. Long after their footsteps faded, she exhaled slowly. The hunger that had made her body exhausted and weak for days finally began to wear off. She shifted and curled herself around her pups, who were beginning to move about, and allowed her warmth to wrap around them like a shield. Her wound still hurt, the deep gash she got from trying for her pups, but she didn't mind. For the first time in days, she felt relaxed, and she realized she needed to rest. Her pups, still weak but no longer starving, pressed against her. The smallest one even let out a soft, contented sigh. Finally, she closed her eyes. By the time Ethan reached the edge of the woods, he knew he would never be the same. The wild had touched him that night, not with teeth or claws, but with something far deeper, with a moment that belonged to him, to Boxer, and to the starving mother who had been willing to face death for her young. He exhaled and reached for the kitchen door. Boxer paused, too, before stepping inside, his ears twitching toward the woods one last time. What started as a terrifying break-in, with a wounded dog, a blood trail, and something lurking in the trees, became something far more unexpected. In the wild, survival can be brutal. But that night, something else took over, compassion. Boxer hadn't seen an enemy, he has seen a plea for help. And Ethan has followed, stepping into a world he never expected to understand. Sometimes the strongest instinct isn't to fight, it's to protect. And for one night, two worlds collided, not as rivals, but as guardians. If this story moves you, let us know in the comments. And if you've ever witnessed an unlikely bond between animals, we'd love to hear it.